We've got huge controversy over plans to mine titanium-rich sand on a beautiful stretch of African coastline. An Australian mining company is targeting the small community of Xolobeni without their consent and at their own personal cost. The residents are in uproar and plan to take the Department of Mineral Resources to court to defend their land. In the studio now, we have the man leading this case, human rights attorney Richard Spoor. Richard, thanks so much for your time. We were speaking briefly off air that yesterday was the first day in court. Can you tell us what happened?
Well, the lawyers for the applicants, that's the Xolobeni community, made an argument to the court. We're asking for an order for the court to confirm that under South African law, which isn't clear at all, that communities, indigenous communities, have the right to say no to mining. So they have the final say whether mining will take place on their land or not. Alternatively, we're saying if that's not the law and if we're compelled to accept mining, then questions about compensation, what's going to happen to us, needs to be determined before the mining takes place, before our lives are disrupted, and not after the mining starts.
Mm-hmm. And this wasn't the case previously, or this isn't the case?
There is a complete vacuum. There is no requirement that people consent to mining on their land. In fact, the law as it stands seems to deny people the right to say no. The state awards mining licenses. And there's also no provisions about compensation, when it must be agreed, how it must be agreed, or what it must look like. So although there is an international best practice, organizations like the IFC have norms and standards that people who subscribe to them comply with. In South Africa, there are no norms, no standards, no guidelines, and the result is often catastrophic for communities. So mining brings with it jobs and development, but it also disrupts traditional ways of living. It disrupts local economies. It changes their structure. It has huge consequences, and many of them are not for the better. So we want those things. We want proper risk analysis done, proper assessments of what's going to happen, and how do we mitigate and control this impact on social and economic, those impacts.
Sure. I mean, Richard, you're essentially taking on the government and also these big mining companies. I mean, that's a big fight. But what has their response to all of this been?
Look, the MPRDA, which is the legislation that permits the minister to award the rights and then the companies to go onto the land without consent and without prior agreement and compensation, is the product of a negotiation between government and industry. As part of the reform of the mining legislation, this was agreed. So it's a compromise between the interests of government and the mining companies. But left out of that agreement were the interests of the community. So we have massive social problems. We've seen it in the Rustenburg area. We see it in the Burgersfort areas where platinum booms have taken place. And we're seeing it in the rural areas where mining is extended in Natal and on the Transkei Wild Coast, where there really is no adequate provision being made for communities. So we're trying to bully that through the courts, if you like, and force agreements that respect our rights and insist that these be imposed on all the parties, government and the mining industry. So
just to put this into perspective, it's not that these mining companies come to a particular piece of land and then tell people who are living on that land, have their homes, tell people, we've got the mining rights now, you have to find another location. This is vacant land that we're talking about that these mining companies come to.
No, it's not. I mean, the best example is private land is typically not a problem. The mine either buys the land or leases the land from the private owner, who's an individual or a company. You do a commercial transaction. But communities are different. These are large, diffuse, scattered areas. The area we're talking about is 22 kilometers long, 1.5 kilometers deep. There are about 85 families living there. So they're all dispersed across this land in their homes. They have cattle, they have ploughing fields, and they move those fields every year. They're allowed to lie fallow. They use the rivers for fishing. They use the sea for fishing. They have access to the sea. They live very traditional lives. It's it's pretty pristine part of the country.
So, because what I'm trying to understand is that the reason why the department awards the mining license for that land, is it an issue of those communities not having the property rights to that land? Is this part of the land distribution or land reform debate?
Even if they were the owners, you know, with title deeds and so on, it wouldn't help them. You know, in South African law, even a private owner can't refuse mining. If the minister awards a right over your land, you've got to consent to the mining. But typically there are agreements, but in the traditional context, in these rural contexts, we often find the chief signs a deal, he gets a 4x4 and a bit of money, and he agrees that this will happen. And what we've had a lot is real open conflict. You know, bulldozers in the fields, women and children and men throwing stones, police involved. We have serious trouble. And the agreements that are concluded are often bad. So we've seen very prejudicial agreements taking place and very prejudicial outcomes. We think that by bringing the courts into the process, we're going to secure better outcomes and better solutions.
I mean, one of those better outcomes that you're looking for is fair compensation. The problem is, how do you determine that, and who determines that?
How do you, I mean, it's one thing, you know, to buy my piece of land for the market value, that's fine, but that doesn't work with communities. We can't buy 22 kilometers of wild coast and settle the community on another 22 kilometer stretch. That won't work. So we've got to live with the mining, but what we're doing is disrupting ways of living. We're disrupting lifestyles, we're dislocating all the social connections in these communities, and how do you compensate for that? Now, what's the worth of that? What does it mean? You used to be a member of a integrated whole society. Now you're uprooted and resettled in a township somewhere. You're now an individual. What is that loss to you? What does it mean? And what's it worth? And why would somebody agree to that, and for what? Those are very difficult questions.
So, Richard, a difficult question now. I mean, if things don't go your way in court, what next?
Well, what we've said to the judge as well, we're talking about Pondo land, and we're talking about people who are really attached to their soil. And one of the things that we communicated to the court yesterday, we're saying, look, it is essential that we get a ruling on this issue, because if we don't, and if the mining company tries to come in there by force, there is a very, very serious risk of conflict and violence between this community. This is not, these are Pondos. They're a fierce people.
For sure.
And they're not just going to lie down and let the bulldozers in. And there's been conflict, there's been violence, there's been talk of murders, of activists in that area, a lot of unpleasantness. And it's critical that the courts intervene and create a stable environment where this kind of thing can be negotiated and settled without recourse to violence.
Well, Richard, we will certainly be catching up with you again for a delivery on the court judgment. When are we expecting that?
I guess it'll take a few weeks for the judge to work this through and come up with something. It's a tricky one.